In this lesson, we're going to look at pedigrees and how you show inheritance in a family. So basically, a pedigree is just a graphic representation of inheritance in a family. Or you can kind of think of it like a family tree, but for traits. This is what a pedigree might look like. Many people are familiar with pedigrees for things like dogs or horses and things like that. And basically, it just shows where you came from. It's kind of like has your ancestry, but it can also show your traits. So how do we read this and draw this? A square is a male. A circle is a female. If it's not colored in, that means they don't have the trait that we're looking at. We can only really look at one trait at a time. If it's colored in, that means they do have the trait. And if it's half and half, they are a carrier or they're heterozygous. So let's look again at this pedigree. Now, if this is you, whether you're male or female, this individual right here is your mom. This individual would be your grandpa. So you see, each level is a new generation. This would be an uncle, this would be an aunt, and this would be a cousin. So this is how you read them. Now what you need to be able to do is identify the type of trait that you're looking at with a pedigree and be able to figure out genotypes and phenotypes. So when we're looking at a dominant trait, dominant traits show up in every generation, and there aren't any carriers. Can't be a carrier of a dominant trait. If you got it, you got it. Individuals that are colored in, meaning they have the trait, are going to be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So let's say grandpa here is heterozygous for this dominant trait. Grandma is not colored in, meaning she has to be homozygous recessive. If we do a quick Punnett square, what we'll find is that most likely 50% of the offspring will have the trait and 50% won't. Let's say this individual marries a woman who has the trait and she's dominant. If we do our Punnett square, you'll see every single one of our offspring are going to have this trait because they're all heterozygous. Over here, that person's heterozygous, meaning again, we're going to be about 50-50. So you can see in every single generation, we have individuals that have this trait. And we don't have any carriers, because again, you can't be a carrier of a dominant trait. Now, recessive traits get a little bit more complicated. They're going to skip generations. You're going to be able to have male and female carriers. And to be colored in, meaning that you have the trait, the only way to do that is to be homozygous recessive. So for example, grandpa here again has the trait. So he's homozygous recessive. And let's say that grandma is homozygous dominant. That means that all the offspring are going to be heterozygous, meaning they're going to all be carriers. So right off the bat, nobody in this second generation has this trait. They're all carrying it. Let's say this guy marries a girl who also happens to be a carrier. Well, when we do the Punnett square, we'll see there's a 25% chance that that's going to match up, and they're going to get an individual who's affected, probably some carriers, and an unaffected individual. So we have skipped a generation, and then it shows up again. This is how a lot of recessive traits work. Like say, red hair. Maybe grandpa had red hair, none of the kids did, and then all of a sudden, somebody comes up, one of the grandkids comes up with red hair. Now again, On this side, we wind up with a homozygous dominant, meaning that we're going to get some carriers, and it can again be matched up in that next generation. So again, skips a generation, and it has male and female carriers. And finally, let's look at sex-linked recessive traits. So these are going to skip generations because they're recessive. They're only going to have female carriers because, again, a male cannot be a carrier of a sex-linked trait because we only have one X. And it's going to be more likely in males for that same reason. They only have the one X chromosome. So in other words, if you're filled in, you're either homozygous recessive as a female or you simply inherited one recessive as a male. So again, let's say grandpa here is colorblind. Grandma is not a carrier, so she's homozygous dominant. We do our Punnett square. We're going to find out we have about 50% carrier females and unaffected males. So let's say that this unaffected male marries and has children with a carrier female from another family. Well, chances are normal female, carrier female, normal male, and an affected male. So this means that this individual would also be colorblind. Now, if you notice, this is one of the reasons why inbreeding is such a bad thing. Because when you have all these carriers, right now we're having carriers come in from other families. But if you're interbreeding within the same family, the chances of you mixing and matching up these recessive carrier individuals is much, much higher. And that's why you end up with a lot of these diseases becoming very prevalent in more inbred populations. And this is both humans and animals. All right, so let's say that on this side we have a male who actually is also colorblind. And he marries and has children with this woman who's a carrier. Now when we do this Punnett square, we'll notice carrier female and an affected female. So notice, once again, the only way that this female got it was because both her mom was a carrier and her dad actually had it. Normal male and affected male. So when we look, it skips a generation. There's only female carriers, because again, males can't be carriers. And it mostly affects males. True, it affected one female, but her dad also had it.